welcome to CCG China and World Dialogue Series. I'm the host of the series, and I'm also the founder and the president of Center for China and Globalization. So in the past January, we just celebrated the Lunar New Year in China and entered the year of the rabbit. Now we are back with another episode of the CCG Global Dialogue Series. And in the past episode, we actually talked to business leaders, senior diplomats, and scholars, including Ray Dalio, Richard Haas, John Hammer, and Larry Summers, for example, just in the last several months. And now this time we have two very distinguished guests. Both are senior diplomats in Asia affairs. Both are well-known in the U.S. and China Policy Committee. And please allow me to introduce them one by one. First, I'd like to have an introduction to Ms. Susan Thornton. Susan is a senior fellow and a research scholar at the Yale University Law School Paal China Center. She's also the director of the Forum on Asia-Pacific Security at National Committee on American Foreign Policy and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She's a retired senior U.S. diplomat with almost 3 decades of rich experience. She was acting assistant secretary for the East Asia and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State, and she led the East Asia policy making and served in leadership position in the U.S. Embassy in Central Asia, Russian, the Caucasus, and China. I remember Susan also was the Consul General of the U.S. Consulate in Chengdu. We hope we can resume that sometime. So Susan, thank you for joining us today from Montana. And also have another old friend, and also, of course, joining us today is Dr. Douglas Paal. He's a now resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He previously served as a vice chairman of JP Morgan Chase International and was an official U.S. representative to Taiwan as the director of American Institute in Taiwan. He was on the National Security Council staff of President Reagan and George H.W. Bush between 1986 and 1993 as a director of Asia Affairs, and then as senior director and a special assistant to the president. I remember very well many times we visited Carnegie, and Doug was really hosting us there. And he held also a position in the policy planning staff at the State Department as a senior analyst for the CIA and also at the U.S. Embassy in Singapore and in Beijing. So Douglas too, welcome both of you to join us. And I know Doug is joining us from Los Angeles. So it's really a great honor to have you both join us today, also the CCG Global Dialogue Series. I want to start, I mean, we just recently, there was a lot of things happening and since we planned this dialogue, and we know that President Biden just gave a talk at State of the Union just about a day ago. And of course, also, we had a balloon incident actually happened that between China and the U.S. I think that I noticed from the President Biden's State of Union speech was largely about domestic. He mentioned about China. He said he wants to compete, not confront. But also he said he wants to cooperate with China whenever beneficial to the U.S. and the world. So probably I just have a quick. Time of the subject. Maybe Susan can give a bit of recent atmosphere, and of course also after that I'd like to have Doug to give us, so then we can continue further discussion. So Susan, maybe your opening remark, and I ask Susan to go first.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Henry, and thanks very much for having us at this really, I think, pivotal time in U.S.-China relations. There has been an awful lot going on recently, but maybe I'll just start and reflect a little bit on the most recent event, which was President Biden's State of the Union address last night. He had a clear focus, I think, on two things really, mainly on shoring up America's strengths internally, especially the economy. He talked a lot about jobs, about US manufacturing, different domestic policies he was going to pursue to make sure that America was, stronger, that people saw opportunities. He talked about US being a land of possibilities, and clearly he's very focused on that. And he used the speech really to tout a lot of the achievements that he's made in the last 2 years in passing legislation to try to move the ball forward in a lot of these areas of restoring US domestic economic resilience and dynamism, I think. I mean, he also talked about shoring up relations with America's allies a little bit, but didn't really talk much about international issues. Usually these speeches are not much on foreign policy. But there was a focus on Russia's war in Ukraine, and there was this reference to continuing the competition with China. But I think we have seen some efforts, and we're going to probably talk about the balloon, which unfortunately derailed the most recent efforts. But I think he did hint at efforts to restart diplomacy with China. As you said, he mentioned we don't want conflict. I think it's difficult to restart that diplomacy now with the sort of recent events and internal political dynamics, which I know we'll talk about. But I think it was a clear indication that President Biden is looking to sort of tamp down rhetoric and right size the kind of rhetoric and attention that negative attention in the US-China relationship right now.
Yes, thank you, Susan, for a great highlight of what recent what activities in the U.S., particularly the Biden's State of Union speech. So, Doug, what's your take of the recent development? Of course, we expect Secretary Blinken to visit, and of course, also Secretary Blinken said he's postponed and wants to come back as soon as possible when conditions right. So things are still open, and but what's your analysis of the current situation, Doug, please?
Well, when we first discussed holding this session that was going to be assessing the outcome of a Blinken visit to Beijing and what the path ahead might be, I think we still have a path ahead, although we haven't had the visit, and it's going to take some time, maybe some healing, before the visit gets back on the schedule and we can start to proceed toward a meeting between the two presidents in the United States, which we anticipate in November in San Francisco, when the United States serves as host of the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum Leaders Meeting. That's all to be set in the future, but the long-term trend in the US-China relationship was to work toward making that a reasonably fruitful period in which to get a better grip on emphasizing communication and avoiding conflict while continuing to compete with each other. And the thing that I take away from this weekend's episode, which temporarily has put off Blinken's visit to Beijing, is that both sides were careful in the aftermath and as the events unfolded to not choose language that put the competition starkly or to issue ultimatums, rather to sort of try to stay in touch with each other so that we did not see what is quite emotionally received by the American public and media as something, as a precursor to sharpened conflict between the two sides. I think both sides succeeded in preventing emotion from riding herd, from making kind of statements that would be regretted later. But we've still got a lot to patch together. And I think the weekend events with the balloon and the cancellation or postponement of the trip by Blinken also allows us to look at what the agenda going forward might be. How do we build a more constructive way of dealing with one another as we go forward? I just add to what Susan had to say about Biden speaking at the State of the Union address on the subject of the United States rebuilding itself at home. I think that the goal of the American foreign policy establishment under Biden has been to use the past 2 years to emphasize a point that was a matter of dispute when China's foreign policy leaders and Blinken and Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, met in Anchorage a year and a half ago, when the fight rhetorically between them was who has a right to speak from a position of strength. The Biden administration can make a strong claim to have done a lot to strengthen America's international position in the time since then. They have an AUKUS agreement with Australia and the UK. They've strengthened and deepened the relationship with Japan, the alliance with Japan, and the Japanese have stretched their wings a bit with their newest national security documents issued in December and statements since then from Prime Minister Kishida and his government. And we're seeing stronger relationships or kind of coalitions building that are intended in various ways and under various changing circumstances to bring together not allied concerns, but coalition concerns to reinforce a resistance to aggression and assertiveness in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that constitutes the floor for the United States on which it wants to proceed in developing more constructive ways of communication with China.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, thank you, Doug. Yeah, I think the both Susan and you actually reflect the current situation. Yeah, I agree with you. I think the the response on the blue incident was quite reserved, as far as I can see. From Chinese side as well. China Foreign Ministry spokesperson already said it's regrettable. It's an accident. It's by this force majeure actually, and also I mean I know that U.S. and China, of course, we have satellite, we have many other means. I mean, if they are probably watched over each other many times over through satellite. So this thing, I mean, is something I think both governments in very serious dialogue and communications. I mean, China has notified as well, and so I hope this thing can really get over, because we have more important things in the bilateral and the multilateral relations. We have, of course, we have this pandemic is still finishing, but we have climate change, we have Russian-Ukraine war, we have global recession still there, and also, of course, there's how we can stabilize the global growth for the economy. So I think there's many more things. So I'm quite actually encouraged by the Biden and President Xi summit in Bali. I mean, last year, which is paved the way. Looks like 2023. We hope to get a floor, build it up. We have a Blinken visit, we have a Yellen visit, we have probably more Secretary of Commerce or USTR visit, and also Chinese visit, senior official visit to the US, and so I hope that this year we will have a G20 in India in September. We have an APEC in November in San Francisco. So there's a lot of chance that we can really upgrade a bit of stabilize a bit of the situation, particularly the U.S.-China relation. So for this to go ahead, so what are the Susan, probably I start with you again, and what are your expectations on how we can maintain this dialogue? I mean, that the momentum that President Biden and President Xi set it in Bali, and because Blinken also said he wants to visit China as soon as possible, as time is right. So we hope that these things can be really taking place as soon as possible. So perhaps Susan, you can give some assessment on your side.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a former diplomat, so I really do believe in having discussions and trying to negotiate and get progress on topics. I have to say on this balloon incident that I agree that it was handled with quite a bit of care and thoughtfulness. I think on the U.S. side and on the Chinese side, I was quite taken by the Chinese statement of, that it was an accident, force majeure, that there was regret that it went into U.S. airspace, and a full admission that it was, it was China's balloon, and that they regretted that it had happened. I think, what I hope is that we could use this incident as a way to try to make the communications more sustainable and more stable and more effective between our two sides. And, one of the reasons that Tony Blinken wanted to make his visit to Beijing, following up on the meeting between the two presidents in Bali, was in order to talk exactly about this problem that we have. Our communication channels have become so truncated, so narrow, that it is very hard. We have such a complicated relationship with all kinds of issues, and yet we only have, at this point, really the channel between the two presidents, which obviously can't be exercised every day, or even, every month. So we've really got to get some channels established. And one of the things that I think the U.S. side feels is particularly urgent is a channel that we can use to clarify what's happening in exactly the kind of situation that we faced over the weekend. And I understand that there were, efforts to get more information and get clarification, and time is ticking. And this has been a longstanding problem, I think, in U.S.-China relations, is to try to get information quickly so that people don't have to make assumptions, because when people make assumptions in some of these cases, they assume the worst. And that's not what we want. We don't want worst case kind of assumptions being made in this relationship. We want to be operating based on facts and reality, to the extent we can get the information from the other side. So I hope that, as we go through this year, building up to, as Doug said, the APEC summit, we can start to establish some of these relationships. Actually, we need interpersonal relationships so that we know each other and have these communication channels. I really hope also that we could start using the embassies and the consulates better. I mean, you mentioned my long career in the State Department. I served in a couple of different posts in China. These are really important connections to have, and we haven't really made full use of them, I don't think, in the recent period. And I also would like to say that in addition to the high-level meetings I hope we'll have, you mentioned Janet Yellen, some of the other economic meetings we hope will happen, maybe Gina Raimondo, maybe Catherine Tai. But we've also got to get people-to-people ties going again, and that means flights and visas. So on the bilateral front, and you mentioned a whole bunch of other issues in the sort of global challenges, which I also want us to work on, climate change, et cetera. But right now, I think, getting these communication links and travel links and exchange links reaffirmed and going again is for me a top priority.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. I think the communication dialogue, resume the people-to-people exchange is very crucial. So good thing about it is that China is probably getting out of this COVID and zero COVID status now. The tourism is reviving. We hope to have more flights resumed. We know that some U.S. airlines going to resume their direct flight from U.S. We hope that can reach the level of before the pandemic. And actually, I was at an event at the Tsinghua University yesterday. They talk about how to build Beijing International Exchange Center, and they said they have 2 international airports. The capacity could handle 200 million people. So we hope we have more visits. But absolutely, the student exchanges, tourism, and also you're right. All the representation from both China and the U.S. at embassy, consulates. Maybe we should resume the consulate that closed in Houston and Chengdu, and also journalists. We could probably welcome more journalists visiting each other in both countries, and that really helps. And I think the momentum set up by President Xi and President Biden at Bali, we hope that the working team, but also the whole society, now given the pandemic is over, largely, this 3 years of isolation can be really resumed, and we really look forward to that. I know I just mentioned about there's some economic there's some themes that alliance that President Biden pursued in the neighborhood of in the region of Asia, for example. But China also wants to join CPTPP and DPA and even IPAF. Probably China could be interested in that as well. So let's have more economic dialogues, and rather than all the security dialogue, dialogue like Quad or AUKUS. So probably, what's your think about this? We're getting into a new administration. The U.S. has a new Congress, and China has a new next month. We're going to have a new government set up in place. So it's time maybe we start some a good communication, and we hope that this balloon incident is very temporary, and we can resume the cool heads. I really agree with Susan that we should not assume the worst scenario. We should really try to think of the let's get more informative exchanges, and then get more dialogues and get more visits. So what's your take, Doc? Maybe I can hear from you too.
Well, I endorse everything that Susan said about needing to improve dialogue and institutional cooperation. I will have to say that with the shooting down of the balloon, it's not over. The event itself has come to a finite end, but the aftershocks will continue as revelations take place, as the equipment is found, analyzed, official announcements or leaks from official findings will make their way into the media. And I think that's going to create a sense of urgency that maybe we haven't brought to our discussion yet this evening. You have to light a backfire against this coming series of revelations early on. The failure to communicate military to military during the weekend when this balloon was still in the air is going to sit very awkwardly with the United States public and with Congress and with the administration. And it would be smart for both sides, especially for the Chinese side, to start being more responsive before events start to accumulate again and accounts come forward about this or that intention. Try to get this back into channels that can be managed between the two sides, and where both sides have a stake in outcomes that are constructive rather than endlessly negative. And so I would introduce urgency into this. Don't wait another few months and then hope that we can patch it all up in August or September before the leaders meet. This is something that needs to be addressed much sooner. And the background to all of this is also the growing Chinese strategic capability. China has long avoided dialogue on strategic arms issues, saying that China is disadvantaged by small numbers against superpower levels of capability in strategic arms. But China has now, in the process of greatly enhancing its strategic arms capabilities, and it needs to begin the process alongside what I was just discussing of direct military to military communication, conversations about strategic arms, whether it's protocols, concepts, launch on warning, and hopefully over time, this will lead to some understandings about what's enough, what do we need more of or less of, that mark the era of SALT and START talks in the competition between the USSR and the United States. That's kind of behind us now. China represents the new arrival on the global scene, and we have to find a place at the table for China to discuss these issues as well.
Yes. Thank you, Doc. I think you're right. We absolutely have to really have more intensive communication dialogue, not let the incident really blew out of proportion. Because I really think there's satellite, there's many other things. We probably have the bloom over each other, now and then. And but then absolutely, let's communicate. Let's not get this out of control. Particularly, I think China, from my perspective, this time is quite reserved, and you know, we clarified, and of course, and we hope that you know, this can be really discussed as we have a mechanism to sort it out, and you know, and let's get over to all those bigger issues that impacting bilateral relations and globally. So I really appreciate your comment. Now, Susan, you know, I mean, you as a senior diplomat, both of you, you know, now look at the bigger picture about Sino-US relations and its impact to the world. I know, Susan, you used to suggest a co-evolution. You know, you had many good ideas. So how can we really, I mean, given 2023, we are having another 2024 election year coming up, but given 2023, with the both new government, you know, U.S. Congress and new State Council of China, and a new Politburo. So what can we really do? I mean, on both sides, to put a floor as our dialogue theme, and building a floor for the China-U.S. relations scenarios and recommendations. And so how can we do that? I mean, we'd like to hear you know, both of you senior diplomat and years of experience of Sino-US relations. So give us some advice on how we can really better have a floor. I mean, we need a floor. We can't just let a free falling of this relation. I mean, as the two largest economy in the world, we have a moral responsibility, not only for the US and China, but for the world. So so both of you have a lot of experience in that. I'd like to hear from you. Maybe Susan can start.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the thing that we have always tried to do in US-China relations, really since the beginning, since normalization, is have areas that we have as a project together, you know, something that we're working on, some areas of cooperation, because, you know, there have always been these areas of difference and tension. We've always had some areas where basically we figure we're really not going to agree anytime soon. So we talk about those, and we realize that we have to manage those. But then we also have areas where you know, we have a lot going on in the relationship, where we have to talk to each other about solving concrete specific problems. We negotiate, you know, in the case of course, the WTO accession, and then all of the other agreements around trade and investment. Specific, you know, we had a BIT negotiation, a bilateral investment treaty negotiation going for about 10 years. So we have areas like that where we're talking constantly about managing problems, but it's about things we're doing together. And then we have areas where we're trying to sort of actually work together to cooperate, to make progress in some areas. So that's been the approach. You know, now I think that has sort of fallen out of favor for the last 5 years in the US government. There was a lot of feeling of impatience, you know, that some of the negotiations weren't bearing enough fruit, that, you know, we were being taken advantage of, et cetera. But I think this still the way forward, even in this very difficult environment where there's all this mutual suspicion, and where really the two sides kind of have now see each other as a threat, which I think is over exaggerated on both parts, but that is kind of where we're at. I think we're really going to need to come up with some way of balancing all of that negative aspect in the relationship now with something positive. And I mean, you know, people have mentioned various areas in where the US and China could cooperate. And I think I subscribe to all of them. But, you know, the thing that really worries me, and the area where I hope we will actually start to focus some energy, is on the international system. You know, all these international institutions that we've built over the last 70 years, and which both the US and China have benefited from immensely, you know, they are now under fire. And, you know, from the WHO, the World Health Organization, that didn't perform well during the pandemic, to the World Trade Organization, which is, not seen as serving to level the playing field in the global economy, or at least by some countries, and the dispute resolution mechanism doesn't function anymore. We've got problems owing in part to Russia's war in Ukraine in the areas of food security for developing countries, energy security for many countries. We've got problems in the global economy. And, the obvious area for the US and China to cooperate as the two largest economies in the world are in all these macroeconomic development, sustainable development goals in the UN, macro financial stability, and all kinds of other areas where the international financial institutions have their mandates. So I think there's plenty of work to be done, and some of this work can only be done with the US and China involved, maybe together with others, but certainly at least the two of them involved and pulling in the same direction. So whether we call that cooperation or not, I don't know, but this is what is going to need to happen. And believe me, these institutions that have been set up over the last 70 years, if we don't tend to them, they're not going to be there, and we're really going to miss them when they're gone. It's very easy to destroy things, but it's not so easy to build up these kinds of institutions and habits of sort of working together in the international system. And I think we really do not want to see the G0 so-called world that Ian Bremmer talks about, the sort of more chaotic, anarchic system. The global system has worked, it's not perfect, obviously. It could be a lot better, and we should work on that. But I think it has really served, a lot of purposes, and we're going to need it again for the next pandemic. We need it to try to work on climate change together in an orderly way among the community of nations involved in that, including very much China and the US. And so I think this is the area that I see that needs work, and that I worry that this sort of superpower competition between the US and China is really going to cause us to be distracted from that, what I view as sort of much more foundational work in the global system, and for our own two countries' interests, more foundational.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree that you mentioned about this of course China-US relation that has a huge stake in this global system. I mean, China benefit enormously from this Bretton Woods system that US led, in the last 75 years, and organizations like WTO, WHO, World Bank, and IMF are critical. I mean, even now AIB is playing some active role. So you're right. I think we are facing the pandemic and how we can really prevent the next catastrophe. And also we are having this infrastructure needs that recognized by all the countries. China now probably build the best infrastructure now, but the US is also putting a lot of investment. G7, EU, G3W. I see probably G3W and also HBI and BI and B3W and the BI can really work together basically, and the EU global gateway. So this year we're having actually China going to have a third section of the Belt and Road Summit. I remember the first summit, the US representative has come. The second summit, US embassy people attended. I mean, this time probably China still welcome US to attend. And let's talk about how we can work infrastructure-wise. Maybe AIB can work with World Bank and ADB and AFDB, and let's tackle some joint project. Would be great. I agree with you that multilateral system that led us so far, that avoided the Third World War, is so important. And then we couldn't have a ground zero. We need a G2, G3, and all those great help. So I think that's very, very important. We urgently need both US and China to work together. So Doug, what's your assessment of the Sino-US relation in terms of international cooperation? And well, of course, we're going to talk about Taiwan later, but let's have an overview of the US-China relations.
Well, we've come a long way from the the dark days of the Trump administration, where we were walking away from international cooperation at every opportunity. And this should be seen as much by China as by the United States as a chance to put on a more constructive agenda. Susan mentioned the WTO. The breakdown of the WTO is a great source of distress for me. One of the problems with the WTO is it has, consensual rulemaking, and so efforts to modernize the WTO failed in the Doha round because there are a few outlying states. But that doesn't mean it's not susceptible to leadership. And if the leading trading states can come together, and that would be the EU, Japan, China, and the US, at least at the core, if they can come together with some proposals for getting the WTO to perform better, the rest of the world will be brought in, they'll be sucked in by the need to get on the same trading principles and rules that the major trading partners have agreed to. I think if China would invite or encourage cooperation among those four major parties to take a new look at the trade agenda, I think there'll be a lot of support for it, maybe more than in the US initially, because the US has grown sour on the WTO. WHO, we've already mentioned. There's a great scope for reinvigorating international cooperation. I wish that in the current atmosphere following the terrible events of the earthquakes in Turkey, we could find a way to cooperate bilaterally or multilaterally. I know China has already promised a lot of assistance, and it's a difficult challenge to provide assistance in those circumstances. But this would be a place where you could get the spirit expressed, if not the material results, immediately accomplished, to show that there's a common desire to rescue the people who are suffering in northern Syria and southern Turkey. And beyond that, we've got one global issue after another. The African recurrent epidemics are not going to go away. We had an operation on the second Ebola breakout between the US and China, and there ought to be institutions put in place to make that a more regular occurrence as these threats to human health emerge around the world, especially in Africa. And there the terrain is a bit more neutral. We don't have our future at stake, nor does China have its future at stake. We can do something to demonstrate common purpose and common capability.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. I think that there's cooperation. At least we need to show the spirit, sympathy, for example, also the support for example, disaster like earthquake in Turkey and Syria. That exactly, I mean, all of us, particularly those US, China, and EU countries, Japan, can work together. I believe China actually is set on those global trading system, multilateral system, like China has applied to jump CPTPP that is designed by the US. We hope US can come back, and China is also applying to jump DIPA, a digital partnership agreement that issued by New Zealand and Singapore. And I hope that US can come to that as well. So we could have more platform to talk about. I even think about APEC. If it's economy related, why not China is excluded from this in this part of the, as the largest economy of this part of the world. So there's many platforms we could resume the dialogue or start a new dialogue on infrastructure and many things. So absolutely, those are areas that I think US and China probably should focus, and also on climate change and also on the global economic status. That's a lot of work that our both countries can do. Now, I think the reason that China, US has been really now in a difficult time, but I don't think we probably can get back to the Cold War because we see there's I was talking to Bali just a few weeks ago. He was saying there's a trade war, there's a tech war, there's a cultural war, whatever. He listed 6 wars that may be going on, but I think we need to avoid that. We're not in the Soviet Union era where we're not so much intertwined. And before pandemic, we have 5 million people travel between US and China. And currently we have 300,000 Chinese students studying in the US. We need more US students coming to China. But what I think is that, that we have to strengthen our focus more broadly on the global issues. And U.S. China are enormously benefiting from this business relation. I just read the news data issued by U.S. government that last year they had another record of trade figures between U.S. and China reached $690 billion US. I mean, a historical high. Again, even though we're having all those agonizing relations, but our trade activity is still going on, and there's more. Many. There was, according to 2 years of statistics, 70,000 U.S. company in China generated $700 billion US revenues in China. So that's an enormous, and also China benefit enormously. So what I think is that what really put us into this is that we try to avoid this. Graham Madison said Huidi's trap, and the same Harvard professor Joseph Knight told me maybe we're now in this kind of a adjustment period. We'll take time, maybe 10, 15, 20, 35. We'll get to accept each other. Maybe China have a different structure, different system, but let's coexisting peacefully. But one of the most daunting challenges, this issue of Taiwan. Now let's get to the core issue. I know that Doug, has you served as a representative, a non-official representative of U.S. in Taiwan for many years. So this Taiwan thing, we see some recent changes, particularly since last Nancy Pelosi visit, speaker that calls attention. But now we see some changes. The KMT just swept the midterm election, and yesterday the vice chairman of KMT, Andrew Shah, is visiting Beijing. So we hope that this cross-strait relations. I mean, before the DPP, we had when KMT was ruling, there's millions of mainlanders flooded Taiwan. There's a student exchanges. There's 300 or 400 mainland husband wives formed a family existing in Taiwan, and there's 1 or 2 million Taiwanese working in China. So I hope that this kind of integration, economic activities could eventually promote a peaceful reunification, rather than we are having these tensions that escalating. Seems to be between U.S. and China on Taiwan. So probably that, maybe I start with you on this very important, the core issue of bilateral relations.
Well, I think it's always important to think of Taipei, Washington, and Beijing as kind of a triangle. And when one moves, it affects the others. They're kind of rigidly bound together. And a lot of the motion from on the Taiwan, U.S.-China triangle has come from the U.S. in the latter years of the Biden administration, latter years of the Trump administration and the early years of the Biden administration. The background music has been mostly military and unpleasant or threatening coming from China. The events in Hong Kong have soured many people's mouths in Taiwan about the prospect for peaceful reunification. They would be asked to sacrifice too much by looking at what's happened to Hong Kong in the aftermath of the one country, two systems implementation. And so they're looking for something else as a formula for long-term management of cross-strait relations. We're now in an election year in Taiwan. As you noted, the KMT did well in the local elections where they traditionally do fairly well. How well they'll do in island-wide elections is very unclear. Who the candidate will be is very unclear. You mentioned Andrew Xia, a former Mainland Affairs Commission chairman from the Ma Ying-jeou period, is now visiting the mainland. I think that's a good thing. I'm glad China's giving him a positive welcome. But you have to be careful. You don't want this to be a partisan welcome. I think this would be a great time for China to begin to relax some of the strictures it put in place on cross-strait relations after the election of Tsai Ing-wen back in 2016. It's time to move to a more constructive relationship. I could see where messages could be exchanged as they previously had been done between bodies on the mainland and Taiwan side without respect to which party is involved, to deal with pragmatic concerns. Transportation goes on, but there's reason for officials or semi-official bodies to communicate with each other about facilitating that kind of travel back and forth to resolve problems that arise. There are lots of human relations problems. As you mentioned, there's a lot of people intermarried across the strait. There's a role for the respective authorities to communicate about the well-being of these people, make sure that what human needs they face can be addressed, where the other side needs to have its role in the outcomes. So this is an area where I think if I were to advise Taiwan, the mainland authorities about Taiwan, it would be to show a little bit of relaxation and tolerance to what's taking place. Try not to make yourself the centerpiece of every political debate that takes place on the island in an election year. Let them discuss among themselves what they want to do, and not always contrast with how you can be more and more anti-mainland. And the mainland has a big role to play in sending the message that says, we don't want to be the big issue in your election. We want you to work things out, and we will deal with whomever wins in a way to try to persuade you that in the long-term peaceful unification is in your interest, and not force the issue before the people are ready for it.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. I think you're right. For both across the street. I mean, now we are post the pandemic, and I hope those three major links or small major three major links can really resume as soon as possible. The flights, the people exchanges, even let's have a tourist starting again of across the street. So this is really a good sign. I mean, there's Andrew Shah, vice chairman of KMT, visiting China, visited Beijing mainland is very important. And so I think that now we have seen the deterioration of China-U.S. relations out of this. Many mechanisms of the communication has been suspended because of Nancy Pelosi's visit last year, and now we have a new Speaker of the House, Republican. I mean, Kevin also McCarthy. So Susan, you've been working in the government for a long time, and then U.S. government have a different functions: Congress, administration, and the legislation, jurisdiction, of course. So what if Kevin McCarthy coming again, and also historically Gingrich came before. So how can we really calm things down? And I remember when Gingrich came, he not only visited Taiwan, but he visited mainland, visited many other countries, and also Vice President Gore came to China to explain things. So how can we make a really smooth cross strait and sign a U.S. bilateral relation, rather than we are facing another crisis coming up, and then maybe jeopardize further U.S. senior officials visit. And we after a while we got to have this new momentum of visiting each other. Guidelines set up by President Biden, President Xi. We don't have to be jeopardized on that. So what's your analysis of the situation that in terms of the Speaker's visit, possible visit?
Yeah, I mean, I think Doug's worked in Congress as well, so we should let him come in here too. But it's very important for people to understand, and this is difficult, I know, because it sounds kind of like an excuse, but that the legislature and the executive in the U.S. really are, co-equal and separate branches. So it's very hard. I mean, if the executive branch tries to stop Congress from doing something, Congress almost on purpose then does it twice as hard because they feel like they don't have to answer to the executive. So it's a very, our system stresses checks and balances. It's one of the things maybe that makes decision making in the U.S. system take longer, et cetera. But it is a check on kind of the power of the different branches in government. And so it is very real that the executive can't stop the Congress from doing some of these things. I do think it's important for the Congress to know more and more deeply about the U.S.-China relationship, about the relationship and the policy toward Taiwan. I remember when I worked in Chengdu and in Beijing, I took congressional delegations always around China. I took a big Senate delegation to Dunhuang and then to Kashgar and to Urumqi. So, I mean, we've had big congressional visits to China, but I think it's really fallen off in the recent period. And I think that should be remedied going forward if possible. But right now, there's also a very difficult domestic partisan political situation in the U.S. And so this is also an opposition member of the Congress, Kevin McCarthy, wishing to take a trip to Taiwan. And it'll be very hard in this current environment to keep that from happening if he really wants to go and if he has the wherewithal to go, which it seems he probably will. My personal thinking on this is that it won't be good for the mainland to overreact to a Kevin McCarthy visit in a year that is an election year on the island. So what I think could be a better strategy is to try to make some, positive, big story, either, with outreach to Taiwan or some positive gesture to Taiwan or some positive thing in U.S.-China relations. But I think the mainland does have a lot of agency here. I see that there's a tendency to sort of just react to things the U.S. does. Now we see this visit coming down the pike, and what I think should happen is that we should make an effort to have a big positive story, at whatever, to counteract whatever the perceived negative impact would be of a McCarthy visit in Beijing. So I think that there is a possibility for the mainland to have this agency and to take action and to try to do something to not have this become a crisis. I don't think either the U.S. or China wants to see a crisis right now or a conflict in our relationship. We're both working hard on domestic challenges, and we have a lot of issues. I know President Xi made a speech recently at the Zhongyang Dangxiao, the party school, about China's modernization. Biden's State of the Union address was kind of about American modernization. So these are the things we want to be working on. We don't want to have a crisis in U.S.-China relations that takes us away from all of that. So, so I hope that we could to get beyond this Kevin McCarthy visit if it happens.
Yeah, right. I think we need to both working on our domestic issue. Like I was talking to Richard Haas and Ridali just recently. Both emphasize, we have to really put our own house in order, and really we are facing a lot of domestic challenges. And one thing is that regarding the Kevin McCarthy visit, now since he's from Republican, and now the executive branch and administration could maybe really say that, okay, they don't favor or they don't really recommend. I think what has happened last time during the Nancy Pelosi visit, we haven't really seen administration or President Biden, saying anything or express a little different opinion, because even they are from the same party. So if now they are from a different party, if administration or executive branch can really say something, that would be encouraging. I noticed the White House spokesperson said, okay, they have no news, they don't really recommending, and probably, and so we'll see their how they can handle this. But I agree with you, we could have more U.S. congressmen, senators, even McCarthy to visit mainland to really see real China, and how well developed, how well connected, how clean now the Beijing sky are, and all those good things, rather than have a serious stereotype and old image that they had in the past. So I really congratulate on your effort when you were here leading all those congressmen, senators visiting around China. And we can resume that. We can really welcome more U.S. senators and congressmen come to China and visit, and then so that let's not just focus on Taiwan. I mean, that is the core issue, and that's really touched the nerves of the Chinese. And I hope that we can handle this with care and also consideration, and that really not to jeopardize. I really hope that Blinken can come before Kevin McCarthy. Absolutely, you know, like, as you said, we set a chain of good exchanges between our two countries, followed by Yellen, and Yellen could come further, and the Secretary of Commerce, and Catherine Tai, USTR, and also Chinese senior officials visiting U.S. We haven't got a senior official visit since probably this new administration, but even during the last time Secretary Blinken, Secretary of U.S. State come is 2018. It was already you know, 3-4 years ago, or 5 years ago, whatever. We need more this kind of high level, so that, as you said, we can take this from a larger picture. You know, rather than really U.S. is really focusing too much on Taiwan to gain politically. I know the system of U.S. Of course, the election year is coming. They want to score political points, but let's also give the world, you know, system, the world, the global system, bilateral relation, and also long-term peace and priority in place to avoid this kind of a potential conflict as much as possible. But Don, you're the expert. You can give some more
just a couple of
comments.
points. I would not count on the Biden administration taking a partisan position against Kevin McCarthy doing one thing or another. That's not how we do things. It won't be beneficial to China's interests either, in my view, to make them even more partisan. The Biden administration did find ways to signal the limits on the Pelosi visit, and I have to say they have been more disciplined in adhering to the long-standing agreements between the mainland and the United States over how to handle Taiwan affairs since the Pelosi visit. My second suggestion would be that China, instead of sending your senior representative in Washington into McCarthy's office and warning him of the dire consequences of traveling to Taiwan, you know, instead say, well, we have differences, you're going to do what you want to do, but we welcome you to Beijing as well. We extend you a formal invitation to come and meet with our National People's Congress leadership and our national leadership, and we can talk about all these issues directly rather than through the media. Take a different approach, a more constructive approach, and borrow from the example you cited, Gingrich going to the mainland and to Taiwan, a good example. I would also look back to the days of our early normalization when Zhou Enlai used invitations to get people to come to China and to shape their views of what China was trying to do directly rather than trying to do it through the airwaves. This is a constructive suggestion, I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I really think that now with KMT Vice Chairman visiting China, and with more resume of the major links between Taiwan and mainland, and we hope that we can generate a more you know, cooperative atmosphere across the street. And also, China said probably many times they welcome anybody, you know, from opposition or KMT, that if they are favored, you know, 92 consensus or whatever, they are all can be really we can discuss, and we can really improve. And the mainland government said even in the future when the reunion happened, the Taiwan authority doesn't have to, you know, pay any federal tax on for that. And there's a lot of preferential agreement. There's probably more upgraded one country, two system probably. We hope to see that. But again, now between the U.S. and China, I think there's a lot of things on the thing that we can work together, and the economy and the global climate change and of course the business. So we hope that we can resume all those activities in the year of 2023. So what do you have now? We in terms of other relations, that you know, the Ukraine-Russian conflict, and of course the European, now we know Macron is coming to China in April. We have seen Scholz has come, German Chancellor. We have a high season now of visiting of head of state diplomacy is after Chinese New Year is running again. We have a new cohort of government officials will be in next month. So we probably will see a lot of things happening. So from your observer as a China hand and senior expert on China-US relations, what do you expect on those global issues, economic issues, and U.S.-China cooperation in the years ahead? Susan, please.
Yeah, well, I think you raised a number of really important points, Henry. I mean, we've had this last 5 years have been a pretty difficult road in U.S.-China relations, but let's not forget that most of those years coincided with COVID-19. So we were having absolutely no face-to-face communications, all kinds of problems. We had to evacuate our embassy, on and on. So we had that issue. And then we also had the Russian invasion of Ukraine and all of the dislocation that's happened in the world because of that, and also strained relations in the UN and in other multilateral organizations. So we had, a couple of big exogenous events that have really impinged on our ability to work together on some of these constructive areas. And I think it's very frustrating for people, in both countries who are looking, for some kind of indicators about, hopefulness for the future, working on some of these global problems, getting some progress. So I really do subscribe still to the coevolution notion that, in order to have, the kind of world, we're still going to remain linked. We're not going to decouple. I think everybody's pretty much now agreed that decoupling is not really in the cards. And if anything shows it, it's this, $700 billion record trade that was exchanged between the US and China last year that the Commerce Department published about yesterday. So we're going to remain linked, and we have to work on these problems. And in order to work on these problems, we each need to make adjustments in order to be able to work together better. And I would say, we need to have more transparency in the relationship, because that's going to help us with this constantly assuming the worst about the other. If we know more about how the Chinese system works, if we can understand better how the decision-making process works, we can get confidence about how things are going to unfold in certain situations, and that will make us, less worried about a potential threat or challenge. So I think both sides need to be a lot more reassured about the other side's intentions, and the way to do that is to get better information and open up a little bit on the information. I think on this balloon incident, just to go back to that briefly, more openness and more transparency about how things are happening and what are the problems in providing information, if that could be done. I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding about the two systems on each side, and I think we need to work on that. But if we can do that, I think real adjustments can be made, and we can work together better over time and try to solve some of these issues. I'm very interested in the provision of global public goods. And we've been talking a lot recently about debt relief. There's an emerging markets debt crisis that is unfolding before our eyes, and China and all of the international financial institutions, private creditors, and members of the Paris Club are all involved in those debt workouts. And we need new mechanisms and new processes to make these things work better for countries and for people in the world. And I think this is the way we're going to have to move forward. We're not going to be able to just exclude each other and have two parallel systems. That's not going to work. We need to be within one system, coexisting, co-evolving, and cooperating, while we compete. I mean, there's no question we'll also be competing, but it's not something we need to be so afraid of.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree that you said, we shouldn't decouple. I mean, that's throughout my dialogue with so many opinion leaders in the U.S. and Europe. I mean, nobody favors decoupling, but yet I think we still need, as you said, we need more understanding and the clarification and the communication. Of course, now there's about over 1,000 Chinese companies now on the entity list, and also we have a CHIPS Act, and now the CHIPS is kind of U.S. restricted on selling to China. So there's a lot of things we need to really talk in, because as you said, we have a 700 billion annual trade between us. I mean, we are already totally intertwined, and China, if China is doing well, it's contribute over a third of global GDP growth. It's beneficial to the U.S. as well. It's proving that the U.S. Which led this system in seven decades has been working. Let's enhance it, improve it, and let China play more active role there. So Doug, what's your maybe last phrase of a dialogue that you want to add on this China-U.S. and the global governance as well?
Well, I think that both of our countries have worked hard to lower expectations for the future. I think the world will breathe a great sigh of relief if we stop making things worse and can sort of stabilize where we're at. My goal would be to instruct each traveling minister or secretary of the cabinet to have one outcome of a consequential nature. Small is better than nothing. Large would be great, but let's be realistic and have something accomplished. During Yellen's visit, for example, we've talked about the Club of Rome, which is a big issue for me. China has all but become a member of the Club of Rome. Its own internal and international practices, as it's experienced more as a creditor nation in these difficult investment environments around the world. And getting closer to the Club of Paris and finding a way to articulate that would be a concrete result of a visit by Janet Yellen. And then as each subsequent visitor goes back and forth, try to find something that says, well, at least they can get the minimum done, get a little bit of work done, and it's not continuing to spiral into the ground. I think that would be my high expectation for a year of low expectations.
Okay, great. We almost coming to the end, and what I think is 2023 will be a really a new year, which is we are out of the pandemic. I mean, almost, and now the world is geared up, and I'm glad that the U.S. President Biden, Chinese President Xi had this great summit in Bali, and they said they're going to have the working team work together, and we hope to put a floor there in building a floor for the China-U.S. relations. And now we still hope that Blinken can visit, as he said, as soon as possible, and then we'll have more probably U.S. Senior officials on trade, on investment, on the treasury, all visit China, and vice versa, and China ministers and vice premier visiting U.S. And let's also have a G20 summit in India in September that probably U.S. President, Chinese president can meet again, and also in APEC in November that both presidents can meet again. So I see 2023 is crucial to put the floor and maybe elevate a bit, stabilize. Probably let's stabilize, not with big hope there, but let's stabilize that, so that we can not let it deteriorating, and we can work together on more urgent multi-front on more important issues around us. So I don't know if you have any last word, and we will conclude, and maybe a final word from Susan and a final word from Douglas, and we'll conclude this very interesting, very informative dialogue. And we're also airing this in China, and we'll be really appreciative of all this, very informative dialogue. So Susan, your last word, please.
Yeah, well, I think what I really hope could happen is that, I know that there are also sort of changes taking place internally in China in terms of the focus of the government on, really jumpstarting the economy again after the COVID opening. And, giving more play to consumption, giving more play to the private sector and entrepreneurs. And I hope we could really get, the international business people back in terms of being welcomed back to China and feeling like, we're getting back to that kind of less securitized and more economically dynamic focus for sort of our economic relationship in both China and the US. But I think there are things that China could do to reassure the US that it's moving in a direction that is not going to be overly emphasizing top-down state control and that kind of thing. I think that would be really important. And it also seems to me that it dovetails with the Chinese government's now focus on the economy and what it needs to do. And I think for the US, that focus on our economy, getting it going, making sure it's dynamic, might also dovetail in this way with making sure that we're focused on growth and helping out other developing countries that are going to be running into trouble this year. And then I think my other thing I hope we can do this year, Henry, is, somehow have some kind of effort to head off further fighting in Ukraine with this Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I know you've written on that, and I appreciate that, but this is a huge issue for the international community, and it's going to drag. If it drags on, it'll continue to really damage other countries and damage the economy around the world. So I hope those are two areas where I hope we can make progress this year.
That's great. Yeah, we all have to concentrate more domestically. I know China have a Central Economic Work meeting that emphasize a lot of a new platform and private sectors and stimulating more economic development in China. So and also U.S. now is putting more on by President Biden also emphasize a bit more on the domestic infrastructure and things like that. So let's really concentrate more on domestic rather than really making the relationship tense. And so we have a lot of work to do. So Doug, your final word, please.
Well, my final word would be to think small. Think in terms of small, concrete achievements that can be accumulated. It's like building a building. You start from the foundation and you lay one brick on top of another to try to get the relationship between the United States and China predictable, not zero sum in every respect, and so that people can then start to make decisions about their future relationship, whether it's a business, investment, trade, people-to-people exchanges, that they feel that there's a framework within which they can do that won't be just washed away by the next bad headline or turn of events. It's an important and a pivotal year in some respects, especially when it comes to Taiwan. So I would concentrate my early efforts on trying to build small but concrete achievements with Taiwan first and foremost.
Yes, thank you. I think your advice is also appreciated. We need to have achievement one by one, maybe even from small. Let's get some good news, get some good project, get some good sentiment building, so that we can really continue that cooperative spirit, even though we are facing a more challenging environment. So again, this is really a very informative, very stimulating dialogue that I had really enjoyed our discussion. I really appreciate Susan, you've been staying late, and also Doug, you're taking your time. And I'm sure our audience will find this very useful and constructive. So I really hope that we want to see you in China this year at some point of time, and hope you can visit CCG while you're here in China. So with this, I would like to conclude our dialogue. Once again, Susan Thornton and also Douglas Paal, I thank you very much for joining with us. Appreciate. Also thank our audience for watching this. So we will see you again next time. Thank you.
Thanks,
Goodbye.
Henry. Good night.
Good night. Good. Thank you.